made with spoken.
The Misconception of October 7th, 2023.
By Elijah Thurman. The misconception. There is a common misconception that the modern-day Israel-Palestine war started on October 7th. This is not true. In actuality, the conflict started in 1917. During the First World War, the Balfour Declaration, a decree to occupy and colonize Palestine, was signed by British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to Lord Rothschild. This declaration caused quite a bit of controversy as it would eventually play a key part in the creation of Zionism, a belief movement focused on the development and protection of a Jewish nation in modern-day Israel. To understand exactly what led up to the October 7th war, we must start in 1917 and truly understand the Balfour Declaration, the holy context, and what came after. Biblical context. Both the Hebrew Bible and the Quran trace Abraham's lineage through the region, with Jews and Muslims connecting their history back to Palestine. Jacob, the son of Abraham, was deemed the founder to the Israelites and would become the person Zionists later point to as a proof of an ancient claim to the land, even though modern Palestinians have inhabited there continuously on that land for centuries. But here's the reality. Palestinians had been living there for centuries, while Zionists in the 20th century weaponized the holy narrative as a political tool. They stood on the story of Isaac, Jacob, and the 12 tribes of Israel to justify the colonization of the people and the land. Though this makes no sense when looking at history, as the Canaanites and later Arab populations had already been rooted in the land for centuries. This religious framing became less about faith and more about propaganda, in an attempt to paint Palestinians as enemies and outsiders in their own homeland. With this context, we can start to learn the modern-day war's beginnings. World War I. World War I didn't start in Palestine, but Palestinians got dragged into it anyway. After Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia in July 1914, the whole chain of European alliances set off. Germany lined up with Austria-Hungary, Russia backed Serbia, France and Britain joined in, and the war spread across the continent. The Ottoman Empire, already crumbling, jumped in on Germany's side that October. Because Palestine was under Ottoman control, its people were forced into a war they had no say in. Nobody in Palestine wanted to die for European kings and generals. They just had no choice. Once again, outside empires treated their land like a bargaining chip, not a home. For Palestinians, it was one more reminder that their future was being written in foreign capitals, never in their own hands. This meant that Palestine was dragged into the war by the Ottoman Empire, far from what the Palestinians wanted for them and their future. Over the next few years, Britain's strategic interests in Zionist lobbying and a desire to gain support for the Allied war effort would grow. Specifically, Britain looked to bolster Jewish support in the Allied countries, particularly the United States, and potentially weaken the Ottoman Empire, which, remember, controlled Palestine at the time. Then, on November 2, 1917, the Zionist Balfour Declaration was signed by British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to Lord Rothschild, declaring a mandatory home for Jewish people in Palestine, basically forcibly pushing out the Palestinians and colonizing the region. The Arab Revolts. Near the end of the First World War, an Arab uprising began overthrowing the sect of the Ottoman Empire controlling Palestine. Once it had fallen, it left an opening for new control. Britain took the opportunity and seized control of Palestine. Britain claimed it was preparing Palestine for independence, but at the same time it promised a Jewish homeland. That double deal set off conflict with Palestinians already living there. Jewish immigration and settlement ramped up. Palestinians pushed back, and violence exploded in uprisings. British rule ended up being less about preparing people for freedom, and more about keeping control while siding with Zionist goals. Living as Palestinians was horrible. They were under military crackdowns, land seizures, and constant restrictions. Britain tilted towards supporting Zionist settlement, meaning Palestinians saw more of their land sold off, while their protests were met with forced prisons, executions, even demolishing homes. They had little political power in their own homeland. This period saw constant revolts and conflicts such as the 1920 Nebi Musa riots, 1922 Churchill White Paper, and the 1936 to 1939 Arab Revolts. Resolution 181. By the start of the Second World War, tensions were high. The United Nations came up with a plan to cut the partition plan for Palestine. The UN's partition plan in 1947 didn't just split the land into Jewish and Arab states. It also carved out Jerusalem as a corpus separatum, or separate body. Basically, they wanted the city and its nearby areas taken out of local control and run internationally. Resolution 181, passed on November 29, 1947, laid this out. Two states, tied together economically, and Jerusalem under an outside special regime. Though the partition plan didn't bring peace. Instead, decades of escalating violence and displacement followed, leading to wars like the Six-Day War in 1967. The Six-Day War. After years of escalating tensions and border skirmishes in the region, primarily stemming from the broader Arab-Israeli conflict, Israeli forces launched a preemptive airstrike against Egyptian military facilities, known as Operation Focus. The war kicked off with Israeli airstrikes, later called the start of the Six-Day War. From June 5 to 10, 1967, Israel fought against Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. Egypt's air force was wiped out in hours, giving Israel total control of the skies and tilting the war in their favor right from the start. At the same time, the Israeli military launched a ground attack into Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, as well as the Egyptian-occupied Gaza Strip. After a long fight, Egypt and Jordan agreed to a ceasefire on June 8th, and Syria on June 9th, and it was signed with Israel on the 11th of June. The war finished with more than 15,000 Arab casualties, while Israel suffered fewer than 1,000 casualties. Alongside the military casualties were the deaths of 20 Israeli civilians killed in Arab airstrikes on Jerusalem. Furthermore, 15 UN peacekeepers were killed by Israeli strikes in the Sinai at the end of the war, and 34 US personnel were killed when Israeli forces attacked the USS Liberty, a US Navy intelligence ship. Israel claimed it was a mistake, but the ship didn't sink. Survivors kept it afloat, even as the attack killed nearly 36 Americans. The Six-Day War concluded with a UN-brokered ceasefire agreement on June 10, 1967. The end of the brief conflict marked an Israeli military victory and resulted in significant changes to the map of the Middle East, with lasting consequences. The Six-Day War Cont. Throughout the war, Israel captured around 70,000 kilometers of territory. The occupied lands included the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. Israel used the newfound land for military and strategic purposes, establishing civilian settlements and creating buffer zones. They put up barriers and cut off Palestinians from the outside world. Living as a Palestinian within the Gaza borders was hell. They were monitored 24/7. Citizens were regularly killed for political gain, and almost every Palestinian voice was silenced by the Israeli government. The city had truly become an open-aired prison, although the Palestinians would not let their people be walked over. The First Intifada and Al-Asqa mosque attacks. The First Intifada was made throughout 1987 to 1993. They would carry out a series of non-violent protests, violent riots, and violent terror attacks. These were carried out by Palestinian civilians and militants in the Israeli-occupied Palestinian territories and Israel. The imprisoned people were done and fought back. Then in 1990, the Temple Mount killings took place. These took place in the Al-Asqa compound in the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. These attacks followed the decision by the Temple Mount faithful to place the cornerstone for the temple. Mass riots erupted. In the ensuing clashes, 17 Palestinians died. More than 150 Palestinians were wounded by Israeli security forces, and more than 20 Israeli civilians and police were wounded by Palestinians. United Nations Security Council Resolution 672, which was rejected by Israel, condemned especially the acts of violence committed by the Israeli security forces, and United Nations Security Council Resolution 673, urged that Israel reconsider its refusal to allow United Nations Secretary-General Javier Pérez de Cuellar to carry out an investigation. Conclusion. The attacks on the Al-Asqa Mosque lasted for 24-ish years. This brings us to the misconception of October 7th. October 7th was a fallout of years of war and conflict. The idea that it started on the 7th is a completely baseless historical claim that undermines and erases the tragic history of the Palestinians. If we erase the past, we are doomed to repeat it.